The voting voice and the body, or how politics participates in the crisis of embodiment metaphysics. When the credibility deficit enters into the self-confidence of the actors, it is perceived as a lack of embodiment. We now know why this cannot be otherwise, since political subjects constitute themselves as hollow bodies by subtracting their passions, as it were. It is not without reason that the thing that remains after what is most important has been abstracted is called the vote. Those who have gone through politicization retain nothing of themselves other than their vote, which cannot be used to express anything that constitutes the fullness and sting of life. The voice of the vote speaks in rigid monosyllables. It says nothing but yes and no, never talks spontaneously about its life. It reacts to nominations, marks its X on the voting ballot, and remains laconically limited to minimal signs that indicate either agreement or disagreement. The political vote is so closely related to silence that abstention sometimes says more than the casting of a vote, as those who have come from people's democracies know, where voting and approval are synonymous. In contrast, the Western right to opposition is praised with good reason as an enrichment of the political vocabulary in the direction of two syllables. But whether the right to vote expresses itself with one syllable or two, it implies in any case the ambivalent imposition on individuals to reconcile all other strings on the bodily instrument of their existence with its political expression, or to silence them. The more sensible members of the political class have therefore tried to initiate an ethical discourse in order to overcome the aphasia that can no longer be hidden. They have an inkling of how important it would be to repair the destruction of language that follows the political reduction of the fullness of expression to a right to vote. In this predicament, the more thoughtful among the politicians have traditionally received aid from classical intellectuals who, in their capacity as spokespersons for collective contradictions and life experiences, created an existentially dense language. The political intellectual, as embodied in figures of the calibre of Jean-Paul Sartre, Heinrich Böll, or Ernesto Cardenal, functioned as a political speech therapist in what seemed to be an elapsed era, waging a highly publicised struggle against monosyllabism. It was above all the writers of the left who tried to inject languages into the public sphere that were meant to be so complex and excessive that even individualised life could recognise itself in them. At the moment there is much evidence to suggest that intellectuals are withdrawing from this function, perhaps because times are too dire for naivety. Unquestionably, we are at present experiencing a kind of twilight of the intellectuals. In this twilight the bell tolls for the experts, together with the simultaneous resignation of the moral generalists. The intelligentsia, the contradictory class, draws new demarcation lines on the map of the real. Not even intellectuals still believe in a common denominator between politics and life, and it was their task to publicly delude themselves about it. Already at the beginning of the 1920s, the writer Hugo Ball spoke of a new age of catacombs that was imminent for the intellectuals. Back then, the ironic break in the political making of the future became apparent to this astute critic of the German zeitgeist. While public life was dominated by simulators of vitality who inflated themselves with new realism, new values, and exclamations of the new ages in the style of, "Oops, we are alive," and the tone of, "We are the partners of destiny." A life of thinking already knew itself to be condemned to an underground existence. Only by becoming inconspicuous and coming to terms with being regarded with contempt by the makers of the future could it help to ensure that anything worthy of life would survive the century's winter at all. It is only with great difficulty that we can shake off the impression that this situation is being repeated today, only in an even sharper and more globalized form than in the 1920s. Ever since intelligence has withdrawn and reduced its spoken political contribution to a monosyllabic minimum, politicians have been forced to fend for themselves in their attempts to spiritually revitalize their profession. They must now start using their own resources to turn votes back into languages. Among those who are serious about this, you can recognize the better ones by how difficult they find the task to be. If politicised subjects are no longer just to cast their ballots but to speak, they must transverse the path of abstraction backwards to the existential source of language. It must be acknowledged that this is an arduous road towards something that is almost impossible. Can automatic answering machines be made to give speeches? Can the disembodied political self, even more barren than the anorexic cogito of Descartes, be so readily induced to speak as if from human life in all its fullness? It is only in this kind of predicament that the recourse to principles becomes suggestive for those affected, because once they are personally embodied, principles seem to remedy the lack of physicality in politics. That is why principles act as guarantors of a full personality, an identity with a broad. That is why principles act as guarantors of a full personality, and an identity with a broad foundation within the discourse of those new political morality seekers. Those who credibly embody higher principles thus seem to bring something substantive to the political game, which emanates not only the monosyllabism of the voting spectre, but also an incarnate principle, a piece of individual culture. Those who embody principles have tied weights to themselves. They are gifted with a gravity of character that cannot be blown away so easily, and provided with a moral chassis that is not so easily deformed. It is striking that only those politicians become popular, as far as it is possible, who are distinguished by a certain well-meaning gravity, and above all by an earthy weight that is not lightened with insights. It is as if populations did not want to lose the overview of what their highest leaders embody. Those who exhibit principles want to make themselves predictable in this way, which is a virtue in a sphere where the production of predictability counts as a confidence-building measure. Without a high degree of embodiment-ready inertia, the desired effect cannot be achieved. But where such principled enthusiasm for embodiment readiness leads is demonstrated to us by the great men and women of politics who meet in Geneva, Iceland, Vienna, and elsewhere to share their inertia with each other. This was obviously written before the Washington Treaties of December 1987. They give the impression that political dialogue is just another word for speaking contests between the speech impaired. Here the political psychology of the principle of embodiment shows its frightening side, whereby it turns out that we are dealing with not so much a psychological problem as a problem of the logic of power. If the political subject embodies anything at all, it is not so much their own moral principles, but the right to exist of their country, party, system, market share. As incarnations of these, politicians' voices and votes are always those of an armed substantiality and a deadly eloquence. If all competing parties in the political arena firmly embody their principles, and they do so with huge budgets, then the weapons systems are the real bearers of the embodiment of principles. They make our values credible and our strength of character compelling. Thus the politician who best embodies their principles is the one who has installed their convictions on launching pads, on the ground, and soon also in the sky. In view of these reflections on the relationship between voice and body in politics that deviate somewhat from the supposed target, something inevitably needs to be said about the metaphysical premises of the term embodiment. Laying bare these underlying premises evaporates the false sense of harmlessness with which the prevailing political science, in Bonn as well, speaks about principles and their embodiment. One does not immediately realize that this term represents a forgotten concept of Christian Platonism. More precisely, a John-like theologumenon that has made its way into trivial language games. In the metaphysical tradition, it is said that existence is divided into the high and the low, the fundamental and the incidental, a spiritual and a material sphere. The spiritual sphere is filled with ideas, principles or first causes, divine categories and forces. The material sphere is that of formless matter without any characteristics. It is dark, spiritless, null and void, and must be guided by the higher forces of form. Matter as the substance of form becomes knowledgeable and real only by the light that shines on it, penetrating into the lack of light. Light brings forth formed figures with attributes out of the amorphous material. The visibility of the visible is based solely on the light that originates in the idea and shines through substance. We encounter the most consequential application of this metaphysical model in the Christology of the Gospel of John, where the realization of ideas is interpreted as the flesh of the Word, and in turn as the incarnation of God. The Word becomes flesh. This is the basic scheme of the leading ideas of embodiment and realization that have shaped the actions and productions of the West. Even those who still invoke fundamental embodiment in political action today, whether they are aware of it or not, are indebted to the Platonic gospel. Occasionally this extends to an openly claimed political imitatio of Christ, when some politicians bring themselves into play as the incarnations of the Logos, especially in the Protestant world. We must urgently hope that Mr. Rao will not build his election campaign and that of his party on a John's gospel of credibility. This would not only be wrong in terms of tactics, but above all, ontologically suspect. What happens in such cases has recently been made available for examination in Jimmy Carter's US presidency, which has been battered by the conflict between Christology and Machiavellianism. Similar experiences are guaranteed to anyone who enters such office under similar premises. The incarnation from above inevitably leads to demoralization or martyrdom, two of the most highly underestimated categories of political science, incidentally. Demoralization follows from the predominance of circumstances over principles. Those who consider demoralization to be the greatest evil should not fail to examine the opposite. For where principles are stronger than circumstances, as in ascetic communities, Jacobin subcultures and totalitarian systems, there principle enforces its incarnation at the expense of all other lives. Is it possible for us to think of an alternative to the incarnation of Logos or the embodying of the principle? We believe that this is the case. This is becoming increasingly evident in current philosophical thinking, and it is this alternative that gives a perspective of the history of ideas and a logical criterion to the manifold attempts at developing something substantially new in the so-called alternative cultures. In post-metaphysical culture, which would indeed be an alternative, an understanding is beginning to prevail that it is not the Word that must become flesh by force, if necessary, but that it is enough to create a place where the spontaneous tendencies of the flesh can get a word in edgewise and have their say. It is no longer a question of embodying principles in action in order to thus subject the inert mass to a force of incarnation from above. Instead, we are starting to understand in an increasingly literal way that the life process's own momentum is able to shine forth in brilliant self-relation. The concept of embodiment has become caught in the trap of its own violence and is petering away within it. After all, that was the history-making power of metaphysics. But alternative ways of thinking about the body have already changed direction, to express it in a set way, while the logical endpoint of the compulsion to embody principles is a total liquidation of the flesh in favour of the Word. Endless perspectives on the self-illumination of life emerge within post-metaphysical learning processes. The moralism of thought and the concept of embodiment is only the appendix of latent necrological metaphysics that drives life towards the point of a deadly realization. Whoever tries decisively enough to think morality and politics from the point of view of the self-relations of intelligent bodies must give up the notion of embodied principles to create space for a self-experience that shines forth in a very different way.